in a moment. He also trained in a very good university in Swansea, but I think he was there somewhat after my time there. His principal academic roles are visiting researcher in environmental biology in the School of Life Sciences at Oxford Brookes University. He's also an associate member of the Institute of Human Sciences at the University of Oxford. He's the operations manager of JRI, John Ray Initiative. He's co-director of the Agriculture and Theology Project and principal tutor in the Certificate for Rural and Environmental Studies at CRES. His latest book is on the table, which is Functional Biology of Plants, an undergraduate textbook which he co-authored with John Bryant. I wasn't going to let Margot get away with the Cardiff City sort of bit, so I thought Martin, in his spare time, when he's not doing all these other things, he is the unpaid curate of Haddenham. St. Mary's. I thought I had that right. Yes. Okay. So, over to the assistant curate of St. Mary's.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not quite assistant curate. No.
Just a virgin.
Okay. Cool. Right. Okay. Well, thank you for the welcome again to. This thing is making a lot of buzzing. Is that normal? Yeah. Okay. We'll see if we'll stop there. That's right. Okay. Hope you enjoyed lunch, and thanks again to our friends from Redcliffe College for inviting us here once again. When I put together this day, because it's generally my job to try and do that in collaboration with Andy, I thought that we needed to look at all of these different issues. We needed to look at how you would do GM crops, why you might actually do them, what you would use them for. We'd need to look at the environmental issues, the food issues, the ethics, the theology, and I think we've largely covered those this morning, I would say. We've touched a little bit on the business, politics and globalization issues, but that's where I'm going to focus for this afternoon. And it's a bit complicated. The globalization problem. Now, for me, I've been investigating this problem for some considerable time. But the issues that we're facing here, I would say, are not necessarily related to whether GM crops are a good thing or not. I know quite a lot of people who would be perfectly happy with GM crops per se, but they're more worried about the globalization issues than any other issue that's out there. Like most technologies, and Joe alluded to this morning, most technologies, it's how they're used and who they're used by that is the biggest of the problems, I think, with GM crops. And the globalization problem is really a symptom of a much wider problem in agriculture and society. And so what we've got, in my opinion, the globalization issue is possibly the biggest issue, overshadowing the whole of GM crops. But it isn't actually GM crops itself. So it's an interesting issue to have a look at. I've never actually seen anybody before attempt to do a talk on this particular issue and just concentrate on it. So I wondered where I would actually start. And I started with this map, which is Don't worry about the data. I'm going to give you a simplified version in a minute. But this is the latest data from 2012 of where GM crops are grown and who is growing them and how much is grown in each country. I thought this was just far too complicated to actually get anything out of, so what I decided to do was to add up the figures that are on, that you can't really see terribly well, for each of the areas, and then show you a much simplified graph. And that's it. And you can see where GM crops are grown in millions of hectares in 2012. So, not too surprisingly, North America is the biggest. Latin America is catching up fast. Asia and Australia, quite a bit. A lot of that China and India. Africa has a reasonable amount, well, a small amount anyway, relative to the others. Most of that is actually South Africa. There's not much in the rest of Africa, but most of it's South Africa. And then Europe is almost insignificant. There are GM crops grown in Spain, but not a lot. And that is the situation today. So if we're talking about globalization, which is what I'm trying to do, that's quite an interesting finding straight away. Why is it that Europe is so different to the United States, North America, and what is happening in the developing world? So I thought, how am I going to organise this talk? Well, I thought what I'd do is to concentrate on really three basic areas, three parts of the talk. First is to look at what's happening in North America. Then we'll look at what's happening in Europe, particularly in the UK. And then think about, as we're in Redcliffe College, Mission Training College, what is happening in the developing world. I've put the three in the middle of Africa, but that's wider than that. So, let's start off then with North America. What's happening in North America? Well, there's a lot happening in North America, as we've already seen. This is where GM crops are grown the most. This is where they really originated, and so this is a key area to look at. When did I first come across GM crops, or the idea of GM crops? Well, I was doing my PhD in Swansea back in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was working on salt tolerance in grasses, salinity. And when I came to writing up the PhD, I came across this book, which was really exciting at the time. Genetic Engineering of Osmoregulation. The idea was quite simple. The plants that I was working on, which were naturally salt tolerant, we would take genes out of those, put them into wheat, barley, whatever, and we would have salt-tolerant crops, and that is really important. We would also be able to do the same kind of thing for drought tolerance. And we thought, yeah, this is it. I was really personally incredibly excited. I thought, yeah, my research is going to be bang on the most important area. To be honest, we were all very naive at that time. We were very naive. We thought that we could do it for this kind of system. And it's 33 years later, and there has been some progress in getting to salt tolerance and drought tolerance, but there's still no major crop out there. Monsanto tried a crop of maize in the States last summer, but the drought was so severe in the States last summer that no crop could really survive it. And even a drought-tolerant crop needs to have water. So, that that's where I started back in 1980. It was really exciting, I can tell you. You know, I just thought this is going to be the future. But what did actually happen? Well, let's look at the sort of history between 1980 and 1996. The first real genetically modified higher plot was 1983, when we modified tobacco to be resistant to an antibiotic. So it wasn't so much, it's a model system really. Tobacco was the big model of the time. It's tended to be less so now, but it was the big model plant. And so we got antibiotic resistance into tobacco. The first crop trials, 1985. 1993, the US Food and Drug Administration allowed companies to market GM seed. First time. 1994, the Flavor Saver tomato, which we'll come back to a bit later, it was approved in the United States. We've already mentioned it this morning. And then in 1996, the beginning of GM agriculture. Herbicide-tolerant GM soybeans became available in the United States. What has happened since 1996? Well, as you can see, this is the latest data again, 2012. You can see a continual rise in the acreage, hectarage, or whatever, of genetically modified crops around the world. You can see in this graph as well an increase in the amount that is grown in developing countries. Now, I think I would do one small warning about this particular graph, is that it depends on your definition of developing, really. And they would include places like China, India, Brazil, and so on in developing, whereas I think there is no real major GM crops in much of Africa. There are in South Africa, obviously. But it's going up, there is no doubt about it. Now, who actually produces the GM crops? Who is it? Well, in 2008, Monsanto actually produced more than 90% of the GM crops worldwide. A number of other companies make up the rest. Some of them relatively closely linked with Monsanto, although competing on other issues. One of the issues that's coming up fairly soon is that quite a number of the patents that were in place on the early GM crops are going to start to expire. And then they should become more or less free into the market. What's going to happen around then, people are not too sure about, but they are beginning to expire. There is also the rise of GM crop research and production in places like China and India, which is not under the control of Monsanto necessarily. And we heard this morning from John Weaver about philanthropic attempts by various foundations to actually overcome this sort of monopoly. But at the moment, we've still got a pretty big monopoly around the world. We'll come back to what happens about that a bit later. 2012 then, in the United States, GM percentages of the top 3 crops grown in the United States are maize, 88% is GM, Cotton 94%, and soybean is at 93% of all the stuff that is grown. So those are massive figures. So you think about it, 90-odd% of the crops grown are Monsanto crops, GM crops, and in the States, those high percentages. So basically an awful lot of that is Monsanto. And those are the three biggest crops. Now, you could say, well, it's been a huge success then in the States, hasn't it? GM crops are ruling, and it's a big, big success. But there has been, and still is, quite a considerable amount of opposition, even within the United States. The opposition's been taking three basic forms. One is battles over patent law. The second is really worries over food safety, which we've covered quite a bit this morning, but people worrying about it. And the third is battles over food labelling. So let's look at those. Possibly one of the, certainly the heroes of the anti-GM brigade, if you like, is this man, Percy Schmeiser, a Canadian farmer who, according to him, now whether one can totally believe him is uncertain, but according to him, back in 1997, he was growing non-GM canola, oilseed rape as we call it, on his farm in Canada. His neighbours all around were growing the recently released GM canola. He discovered when he was spraying some of his fields that he'd got herbicide-resistant plants. And so what he did was, he waited until they flowered and produced the seed, and then he kept the seed until the following year. He then planted this seed and grew it, and surprise, surprise, it was almost 100% GM. It was herbicide resistant. At which point he was sued by Monsanto. It went into the Canadian courts. Schmeiser actually won in the lower courts, but it ended up at the Supreme Court about 2005 in Canada. You can tell it takes a long time going through this. And in the Supreme Court, he actually lost. He didn't have to pay expenses. I think the Canadians, I think the Canadian legislature wanted it basically to be a draw. And although Monsanto were vindicated, they didn't actually get any money out of Percy Schmeiser. Now he said this: "Now at 70, I am involved in this fight with Monsanto. I stood up to them because a farmer should never give up the right to use his own seed. I felt very strongly about it because my grandparents came here from Europe in the late 1890s, early 1900s, to open this land to be free and to grow what they wanted to grow. Now we are going back to a feudal system that they left because they were not free. Basically, we are becoming serfs of the land." You may or may not agree with Percy Schmeiser, but that was his statement. Now, actually, Monsanto have had hundreds of these type of cases, and they've nearly always won them, or they've settled out of court winning them. The most recent has been really sending some reverberations through the whole industry is Bowman versus Monsanto only last month. American farmer, he did something rather different. What he did was he went to a grain elevator and bought just some commodity seed of soybean. And he sowed it, and he then, surprise, surprise, found that it was herbicide resistant. Of course, if most of the crops grown in the United States are herbicide resistant and from Monsanto, then they're almost bound to be herbicide resistant. So he got sued. And this time he actually lost in the lower courts and ended up at the Supreme Court on the 19th of February 2013. The decision won't actually come out until June, but it looks like he's going to lose because the comments of the judges were such that he looks almost certain to lose the case. So, we've then had battles over patent law. There is, within the United States, also quite a bit of concern, not as much as in this country, but it is there, about genetically modified food and about eating it. Now, it may or not be justified concerns, but those are the concerns. You can see quite considerable numbers are extremely or very concerned about GM crops. Some surveys, though, have suggested that the majority of the US population don't even know that they're eating GM crops. And that's really quite interesting. On the same day that President Obama was re-elected in November last year, something called California Proposition 37, the result of that also came out. And that was about labelling of food in California with this contains GM crop material. And the environmentalists, of course, were very much in favour of it. It is well known that Monsanto and other chemical companies put out a large amount of publicity indicating that prices of food would go up very markedly if they did such labelling. And the result was this: a narrow victory for no. So there will not be labelling of GM crops actually in California at the moment. But there are a lot of other states looking at such legislation. The most recent, 22nd of February, New Jersey are looking to be the first state to introduce labelling of genetically engineered food. Whether they will succeed, we don't know. But there are quite a number of states looking at that. At the same time, Monsanto and some of the industry would like to make it so that Europe and other countries did not have labelling. And that's where we come to Europe. As we have seen, Europe and the UK is a very, very different situation. We've got very little GM here, and we want to think a little bit about why that might be the case. What is it about here that is different in some way? The early history of GM in the UK. Personally, I'm not a great fan of the term Frankenfood. I just don't like it at all. It came about at this sort of time, and I don't think it's at all a good terminology. It actually came from the States originally, but that's a label that has stuck particularly in the popular press, shall we say, the tabloids. The first GM food then, the flavour saver tomato, as we said, was approved in the United States in 1994. Tomato paste arrived, it was GM in Britain. At first it sold well, and it actually rose to the top of the tomato paste league for a while. But then there were a number of issues, which I don't want to go into, that were widely publicised, and it was withdrawn in 1999, and these supermarkets almost all said, we're not going to stock any more GM. So it went quiet for a little while, and then the UK government decided that they really needed to seek out public opinion on GM. And so we had the GM nation debate, which was very interesting. So we had all around the country little debates here and there, and we had an online system for registering opinions and votes on the topic. I actually went to one of the debates, which was in Dorchester Abbey. They were quite often in churches, and that was when I first saw next speaker, which is Christopher Jones, and he was on the panel that evening in Dorchester Abbey, GM Nation debate. The result was overwhelmingly anti. Yes, there were people who were interested in food issues and food safety, but the peculiar thing was that the two big things that they were most concerned about, people replying to the survey, were environmental issues and the globalization issue. Those were the two big ones. People said that it was fixed. The environmentalists and the world development people had actually fixed by just publicising it so much. Who knows? But the truth was that it was overwhelmingly against GM. Why is there so little GM in the UK? I've given this an awful lot of thought, and why is it that it's the same largely across Europe? A lot of it isn't necessarily logical, right? It isn't necessarily logical, but I've given it a bit of thought, and these are, well, I've got three ideas as to why we might be so worried about GM here and in Europe. Right, first idea, this is obviously not the UK, but this is the Great Plains. Actually, as alluded to this morning by Joe, truth is that North American agriculture is much more industrial than our agriculture. This is the Great Plains with me taking off from Winnipeg, and you can see miles and miles and miles of wheat fields and not very much else. Very, very intensive agriculture. Now, contrast that with the UK, the Cotswolds. Margot and I like walking in the countryside, and we do. And we walk on the paths because we're good people, and quite often the farmers, like John Neal over there, will put nice paths straight through their wheat fields for you, so you can walk through your wheat field, no problem whatsoever. And it feels like natural, doesn't it? Now, if you try to do that in the United States, you'd probably get shot. But this feels like we're out in nature, right? Now, I know, and most of you, if you think about it, know that that isn't really natural. There should be forests there. There shouldn't be wheat. It isn't natural, but we think it's natural. And we think, not sure it really feels natural if we're walking through GM crops. And I think that is a problem. And it may not be logical, but I think it is a problem. next is that really since the time of the whole GM debate, we have seen an incredible rise in what you might call ethical food. So fair trade has risen hugely, organic has risen hugely, locally grown, huge amount of interest, farmers' markets, huge amounts of interest. And this is where at least the middle classes of this country are going. Now I know it's not the case at the lower ends, but the middle classes are heading this direction. And GM just feels not to fit with this kind of thinking. And you know, it may or may not be logical. I know Joe would say, well, we could actually potentially, why don't we have GM, locally grown, organic, whatever? There's no real reason why not, but it doesn't fit with this kind of thinking very well. And then we've also had a number of what you call food crises. The most recent, the lasagne, couldn't resist that one. But again, these are not to do with GM crops, but they're in that same kind of box in a lot of people's minds. And you can't deny that they're in that same box with a lot of people. And so, you know, that is an issue. It really is an issue. Now, where is the UK on this? In Oxford, not far from where we live, this year, the Oxford Farming Conference, one of the really most important conferences. Owen Paterson, Environment Minister, spoke on this very topic of GM crops. And he said, we should not be afraid of making the case to the public about potential benefits of GM beyond the food chain. For example, reducing the use of pesticides and inputs such as diesel. I believe that GM offers great opportunities, but also I recognise that we owe a duty to the public to reassure them that it is safe and beneficial innovation. Notice safe and beneficial innovation, we'll come back to that in a minute. Also on the, that conference was Mark Linus, famous environmentalist, very controversial guy now because he's switched to being pro-nuclear and he has switched to being pro-GM. And he started his speech. I want to start with some apologies. Basically apologised for being the founder or one of the founders of the anti-GM movement in the 1990s, for ripping up crops, all that sort of stuff. He went on to conclude, this is his conclusion. The conclusion is very clear. The GM debate is over, it is finished. We no longer need to discuss whether or not it is safe, although I think many of the scientists, like Joe would say, we've still got to discuss whether it's safe. Over a decade and a half, with 3 trillion GM meals eaten, and there's never been a single substantiated case of harm. You are more likely to get hit by an asteroid than to get hurt by GM food. Yes, but, and the but, I think, if you look down all the comments, I did a little search on Monsanto, on Mark Linus's speech. He mentioned it once. This was the start of GM crops Monsanto grew. There were 179 mentions of Monsanto in the comments about his article. Most of them going on about globalisation. So it's safe, yes, but what about the globalisation issue? Right. The Guardian, very helpfully, at that time of that meeting, published a little poll saying, are you convinced that GM food is a safe and beneficial innovation? Are you convinced? Right. Hands up, those of you who want to say, yes, you are convinced. Safe and beneficial innovation. Hands up. Okay, those of you that want to say no to this question, how many of you would say no to it being safe and beneficial? All right. And how many of you would want to abstain? One lot of abstentions or don't knows. Yeah, well that's quite interesting, because a friend of mine at Oxford Brookes, oh, that's the result there. And you can see that actually the result is relatively similar to the group in the audience. 28% said yes, 72% said no. But, interesting point. A friend of mine at Oxford Brookes, Anna Osterrader, who's a plant cell biologist who uses GM techniques in her research and pretty pro, she said that Guardian GM question, it's missing a not sure, depends option. And what actually I spotted on Twitter and on Facebook was that there were some really quite top plant scientists, professors and all kinds of people whizzing around saying, quick, go to vote on the GM site, you must get more people to vote yes. At the same time, all my environmentalist friends say, go to this site, you must vote no immediately. So you've got this incredible diversity. What's going on there? You know, definitely a big split in the UK. Where does it stand now? The GM stalemate in Europe. As we've already heard, it takes a long time for things to go through the whole system in the European Union. This article was really quite interesting. It indicated the sorts of things that Joe was saying this morning, that it does take a long time to work through, and basically a whole lot of products are stuck in this system and have been for years. The lady responsible for this article, Louise Fresco, said that she felt that it was the problem was Europe's lack of trust in GMOs, reflecting a wider distrust of science. Now you'll notice that this is actually in Science, the American journal. I think it's quite interesting to reflect on the fact that we seem to be worried about food. If you go to the United States, their distrust of climate science, their distrust of evolutionary science, their distrust of stem cell research, much higher than our distrust here. So there are distrusts all over the place. Developing world. I think we'll move on now and just consider some of the issues there. We heard a little bit this morning about the topic of golden rice, so I thought I'd fill you in on that. You can see it really is golden, it really is a different colour to standard rice. Golden rice produces beta-carotene, precursor of vitamin A, idea to produce a fortified food to be grown, consumed in an area where there is a shortage of dietary vitamin A. Yeah, it's taken a long time, this project. Now, it's a very important project because if it succeeds, there are a lot of people who won't die, who won't go blind as a result of it. The research took 8 years, was published in Science in 2000 by Ingo Potrikas and Peter Bayer. They went to field trials, the first field trials in 2004. Next. Potrikas is a philanthropist, and generally I think he's a good guy. What he wanted to do was to make sure that this golden rice was distributed for free to subsistence farmers, that they wouldn't have to pay for it. And so he and his colleagues spent a lot of time going round all of the companies that had contributed to the project and the little bits of genetic stuff that they'd done, and persuading them that this was a humanitarian project and that we weren't going to charge anything for it. And he persuaded the whole lot. And to their credit, Monsanto agreed to waive their bits as well. So they're not all bad all the time. Okay. The plan is that when it goes to production, that there is a $10,000 cutoff between humanitarian consumption and commercial use. So if a farmer of golden rice makes less than $10,000 a year on it, no royalties will be paid. And in addition, farmers are permitted to plant, to keep and replant the seed. So this looks pretty good. Now, I personally think this is a good thing. If it can work, it's going to be brilliant. The opponents will say, and have said, well, there's lots of other sources of vitamin A, why don't we just get lots of carrots, that sort of thing. They also say that this is a kind of Trojan horse. That, you know, if this golden rice, which is a good thing, goes into the developing world, that it will then force other things to get in as well. And so we'll lever away it. Now, a few weeks ago, in The Guardian, they said that this was going to happen this year, we were going to be planting it. They were wrong. Very unusually, IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, decided to make a press release very recently, last week. In short, golden rice will be made available broadly to farmers and consumers in the Philippines if it is approved by national regulators and shown to regulate vitamin A deficiency in community conditions. So that's still going to be checked out. So this process will take another 2 years or more. So still a long way to go and no certainty with golden rice. Terminator genes. We heard about this a little bit this morning. And what are they? Well, basically, they restrict the use of GM plants by causing the second generation seeds to be sterile. That's the commonest use, although I'll mention another one in a minute. And so you can plant you buy your seeds from your company, you grow them, they will produce seeds, you can then eat those seeds, but you can't plant them because they won't go anywhere. This would prevent gene movement. One of the problems and one of the snags that that Joe was mentioning this morning is this idea of genetically modified crops actually crossing with weeds and that sort of thing. Stop all of that head for sure. But of course it would mean that the farmers were always having to buy seeds from the companies every year. Actually, it has not been commercialized as yet. Monsanto have actually said they will never commercialize it. However, there are one or two things happening. Particularly that recent case in the States, patent battles that they've been having. That Bowman case has got them a little bit rattled. And I saw in Nature just 2 weeks ago, Nature, the big science journal, the British one, if they lost the patent battles, then the Terminator gene might be back on the agenda because they would need to protect it somehow. But they did suggest a neat change to the Terminator gene, which I've not come across before, but the idea, instead of them not being able to grow the seed anymore, that it would switch off whatever the property was that you bought it for. So you'd still be able to grow the plants, but it would lose its herbicide resistance after one generation. So that's an interesting one. So patent battles there again, possibly. Getting near the conclusion. This was quite an interesting article from John Vidal this time last month. Hard to trust GM when it is in the grip of a few global giants. And I think this is the nub of a big problem. I fear much of the problem of trust stems from the chemical company Monsanto, which from the start has been the world's largest producer, researcher and distributor of the crops. Its fierce use of patents, its heavy-handed lobbying of governments to deregulate markets, and its buying up of seed companies internationally have scared the public, raised concerns among small farmers the world over, and denied the public the potential benefits. So even if you think they're a good thing, then you've got a problem of globalization. What are the alternatives, particularly in a developing world context? A few years ago, it's pointed out this report by Christopher Jones, who's one of its greatest advocates, and I think he'll say a little bit more about it. But something called the IASTED report came out. Massive agriculture world report. Thousands of scientists and agriculturalists involved in putting together a report. And it was interesting that they had relatively little to say about GM. So genetically modified plants and GM fish may have a sustainable contribution to make in some environments, just as ecological agriculture might be a superior approach to achieving a higher level of sustainable level of agricultural productivity. So that's one of their statements about GM, but there's not a lot there. They think there's a lot of other things we've got to be doing on agriculture. So it's part of the solution. Very recently, SRI. Anybody heard of SRI? Yeah, yeah, Mark has. Yeah, one or two others. SRI. First heard about it at a place called the Asian Rural Institute, which is a Christian institute in Japan, which trains development workers in organic agriculture for places like Africa and parts of Asia. Their philosophy basically says, well, most of these countries can't afford pesticides, can't afford the fertilizers, the herbicides, all of that anyway. What they have got is huge amounts of labour. So, if we train them to do organic agriculture properly, then we can actually make a significant contribution. At the time, they were experimenting with this SRI, system of rice intensification, which basically involves growing the rice in much drier conditions than normal, and so you grow it in much drier conditions and planting it further apart than normal. And some of the results are quite remarkable. You do get massive yield increases under some conditions. When I got back home, I started investigating it, and it's a massively controversial technology. Very, very recently, again, John Vidal came up with this article, 16th of February. It reappears, and this guy in India has apparently grown the biggest crop of rice ever using this technique, using SRI. And since Vidal's article, there's been quite a bit of criticism of it. Interesting, one of the criticisms came from China, the Chinese expert on SRI. They'd really gone into SRI in a big way. And he said, no, I don't think it can actually increase it as much as this guy is saying. But, you know, in China, we regularly get 10% increase in yield using SRI. Interesting stuff. a potential alternative. So, my conclusion on globalisation. Number one is the huge difference between Europe and North America. It's not just a minor difference, we have a massive difference between Europe and North America. Key battles that are going on at the moment are over patents and over food labelling. No doubt about it, those are the two big ones that are out there. At the moment, much is actually controlled by one large company. Again, no doubt, that may be beginning to change. If it does, I think it can only be a good thing. I don't think, however good or bad a company is, that they should really own over 90% of any one technology in the world. And so, in conclusion, even if the technology is proven to be safe, then the worries over multinational control are real, and they really do need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. It's been opened up a whole new area of issues this afternoon. Are there any questions from people or any statements anyone wants to make?
I haven't quite said it, Martin, but this is, you've got close to what is a very big issue. We all need to eat. We all need to know what we should be growing and what this type of soil, etc., etc. But if the research is left in the hands of the companies, then they're always going to go in the areas that's going to make them the maximum profits. But what we want is fully independent research, but how is that ever going to be funded? Because that was the only way we'll ever get the truth.
Well, as we've seen, and John Weaver mentioned it this morning, there are attempts at any rate at funding research which is of a kind of independent nature, which will not mean that we end up with the same kind of problems that we've got presently. But there are attempts at that, and we'll have to see how those actually work out. As I said, the rice example, golden rice, I think actually if that can actually be got to work, I think it's a good thing. On the whole. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
I come from a position, this is where,
Yes, it is.
it's very directive ignorance about this, but it seems to me the great thing about the golden rice is that it's putting something which is beneficial for diet into rice. It's not the same thing as putting a pesticide or something which actually affects the whole of the sort of environmental surround of the crop. And would you make a distinction between that?
Yeah, interesting question. Would I make a distinction between, say, BT crops, which you put pesticide into the crop, and golden rice? Well, obviously there is a difference, because one is intended to put off insects and the other one is intended to actually benefit the people that eat it by increasing their vitamin A content. But they've both been genetically modified. I suppose those are that's a similarity. I don't think that there is that much of a difference. I think where the difference tends to lie is in where the profits are going and how it's all handled. With golden rice, they have it set up where the profits are going into a kind of trust fund situation rather than into shareholder type situation.
One of the difficulties is knowing who to believe. You've given some statistics. I was sent excuse me, an email by John Wigley, who many of you will know in this room. And this was a report that GM crop acres in Africa, South Africa, had gone up to 600,000 hectares, a 26% increase. However, the African Centre for Biosafety says that they've overestimated by 400% the amount of actual GM acres. Who do you believe?
Well, to be honest, I wouldn't know. I mean, I've given you what seem to be the industry standard statistics. I think you would undoubtedly have to say that they've massively increased. I don't think whatever statistics you go on, you could deny that GM crops have massively increased around the world. Now, what's actually happening in an individual country like South Africa, I couldn't really say without going out there and doing an awful lot of work.
One last question.
Claire Ashton. From a layman's perspective, it seems to be that for sort of hundreds of years, we've managed to do kind of genetic modification by crossbreeding and things, and to develop new varieties of things with beneficial properties. And to some extent, some of the GM technology seems to be just doing a speeded up version of that, whilst there are other things, I'm assuming for example animal genes inside of a plant, that you could never get by kind of natural kind of purposes. So where in your view is the kind of dividing line, I suppose, by things that could have almost happened naturally but have been speeded up? But is there that is there a dividing line, I suppose, between things that are, you know, completely sort of synthetic? Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something that I have wrestled with myself, and it really comes back to the kind of more or less back to the kind of ethics area as to what you might consider to be acceptable. And you see, me personally, not as a scientist, but as me personally, I sort of say, well, you know, with herbicide resistance, we've really just very largely speeded up a process a breeding process that would normally have happened. Because you can do it, and still, as Joe pointed out, quite a lot of the crops, herbicide resistant, are actually still produced through conventional breeding. And you know, it's like this as to which one is problematic. When you get to BT, you've actually introduced a bacterial protein into a plant which wouldn't normally happen. It can happen occasionally, but you do get viral proteins going into plants quite naturally, but bacterial proteins like that wouldn't normally suddenly find themselves being expressed in plants. And when you get to things like freezing tolerance, we're thinking about moving fish genes into plants to increase their freezing tolerance. Once I start moving fish genes into plants, I start getting uncomfortable. And it isn't scientific. You know, I can't say a reason why I feel uncomfortable. But once we get to that kind of area, I start feeling comfortable. And so, yeah, I think there is a spectrum. I feel perfectly happy at the plant and speeding up plants things. But I start to get more and more uncomfortable as I start here towards adding animal genes into plants.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's very, very helpful. Thank you. Just one comment of my own. I was very interested in that idea of Plato and the sort of Aristotle and the sort of static universe, which very much the Greek view that the universe is eternal and you just got to study it and understand it. And the whole development of science has come out of a Christian, Jewish, Islamic sort of culture which believes in an origin of creation and the development and change of nature and creation. And it's quite interesting to think of GM, I think, in that context and where it fits and where it doesn't fit and how we move forward on it and of this dynamic world, how we go forward on it. Well, I thought of our speakers, it would be good to end with a farmer, and I indeed also first encountered Christopher at Dorchester Abbey talking about GM and we have his write-up in our leaflet. He's both been involved in agriculture in the UK and in Africa, with a degree from Oxford University of Agriculture on those great days when that was still possible, and very involved with the Church Mission Society for many, many decades.